A Christmas Quilt of Memories. Snow fell quietly outside, blanketing the yard in a soft layer of white. Inside, the house buzzed with the warmth of the holiday season. Baking cookies in the oven, the faint scent of pine from the Christmas tree, and the clatter of children's laughter. Sarah, standing in the kitchen doorway, smiled softly at the sound of her two children, Ellie and Tommy, who were busy arguing over which Christmas movie to watch that night. It had been a busy few days of preparation for the family. The holiday rush always brought a mixture of joy and stress. But this year, Sarah felt something else beneath the surface, a longing she hadn't fully acknowledged yet. Christmas had always been special to her, a time when her grandmother's house was the center of family gatherings. But since her grandmother passed away several years ago, there had been a noticeable absence in her life during the holidays. This Christmas, more than any other, the memories of her grandmother seemed to tug at her heart. She hadn't meant to spend so much time in the attic. The plan had been simple. Fetch the old Christmas decorations, hang them with the kids, and move on to the next task. But the moment Sarah had pulled down the old, dust-covered box, she knew this wasn't going to be just another trip into storage. The box was heavier than she remembered, filled not just with ornaments and tinsel, but with memories. As she opened it, her eyes were drawn to a corner of the box where something soft peeked out. A worn piece of fabric with a faded floral pattern. Her breath caught in her throat as she gently pulled it out, the familiar weight of it heavy in her hands. It was the quilt, her grandmother's quilt, or at least the beginnings of it. Sarah's fingers traced the uneven stitches, the squares of fabric that had been meticulously chosen and sewn by her grandmother's loving hands. Each square told a story, a piece of the family's history, woven together into a tapestry of memories. Some squares were complete, their stories already told. The small embroidered house that marked the family's first home, the wedding ring quilt block symbolizing her parents' marriage, and the tiny hand-stitched Christmas tree that celebrated the holiday traditions her grandmother had started long ago. But many of the squares were unfinished, their edges frayed, the stories yet untold. Her grandmother had passed away before she could finish it, leaving behind this half-stitched quilt, waiting for someone to carry on her work. As Sarah held the quilt in her hands, a wave of nostalgia washed over her. She remembered the Christmases spent at her grandmother's house, the way her grandmother would sit by the fireplace, telling stories about each square. Every year she would promise to finish the quilt, but as her health declined, the project was set aside. Now, here it was, waiting to be rediscovered. "Mama, what's that?" Ellie's voice broke through Sarah's thoughts. Sarah looked up to see her daughter standing in the doorway, her curious eyes fixed on the quilt in Sarah's hands. Behind her, Tommy peeked around the corner, his face scrunched in confusion. "It's Grandma's quilt," Sarah said, her voice soft. "She started it a long time ago, but she never got to finish it." Ellie stepped closer, her fingers reaching out to touch the fabric. "It's pretty," she said, tracing the outline of the little house stitched into one of the squares. "What's it for?" "It was meant to tell the story of our family," Sarah explained, holding up the quilt for them to see. "Each square represents a memory. a special moment in our family's life. Grandma wanted to finish it and pass it down, but she never got the chance. Tommy moved closer now, his small fingers brushing against the unfinished edges. Can we finish it? Sarah blinked, surprised by the question. She hadn't considered that possibility, but now, holding the quilt and seeing her children's interest, the idea took hold. Why not finish it together? Why not use this Christmas to continue her grandmother's legacy, stitching new memories into the quilt alongside the old ones? A smile tugged at the corners of Sarah's lips. I think that's a wonderful idea, she said, her heart warming at the thought. Maybe we can all add a square this Christmas, a memory from each of us, so that Grandma's quilt can finally be complete. Ellie's eyes lit up, and Tommy grinned with excitement. Can we start now? He asked, bouncing on his toes. Sarah laughed softly, folding the quilt carefully. Let's wait until your grandparents and Uncle Daniel get here. I'm sure they'll want to add their memories too. The children nodded, their excitement palpable. As they ran off to continue their Christmas preparations, Sarah held the quilt a moment longer, her fingers lingering on the worn fabric. In that moment, she felt a connection to her grandmother that she hadn't felt in years. This Christmas, they would finish what she had started, together as a family. With the quilt folded in her arms, Sarah carried it downstairs, her heart filled with a sense of purpose. Christmas had always been about family, about memories, and this year, they would stitch their history together, one square at a time. By the time the first car pulled into the driveway, the house was filled with the warmth of Christmas lights and the sound of holiday music playing softly in the background. Ellie and Tommy had raced to the front window to watch for their grandparents, their faces pressed against the glass as snow continued to fall gently outside. "They're here!" Ellie shouted, bouncing on her toes as the headlights turned into the driveway. "Grandma and Grandpa are here!" Sarah smiled, wiping her hands on her apron as she moved toward the door. She felt a familiar wave of anticipation mixed with a little anxiety. Hosting Christmas was always a joy, but it came with its own set of challenges, especially when it involved bringing together the different dynamics of the family. As soon as she opened the door, the familiar sound of her father's deep voice echoed through the crisp winter air. "Merry Christmas," he boomed, stepping out of the car and shaking snow from his hat. Sarah's mother followed closely behind, holding a covered dish of homemade casserole that had become a staple at every holiday gathering. Come in," Sarah called, ushering them inside before the cold air could steal too much of the warmth from the house. The entryway became a flurry of hugs, kisses, and coats being hung up. Ellie and Tommy chattered excitedly with their grandparents, who greeted them with warm smiles and soft chuckles. Soon after, another car pulled up. This time, it was Daniel, Sarah's brother, and his wife, Grace, along with their 2 teenage children, Lily and Noah. The moment they stepped inside, the house seemed to shrink, filled with voices, laughter, and the subtle undercurrent of family tension that always came with Daniel and Sarah's reunions. It wasn't that they fought or even openly disagreed. It was more of an unspoken distance between them. Over the years, life had pulled them in different directions, and while they loved each other, there was a lingering sense of unresolved conflict, small misunderstandings that had never been fully addressed, and the occasional competitive edge between their lives. Daniel had pursued a corporate career, which often seemed worlds away from Sarah's life as a single mother and teacher. Their paths had diverged, and the gap between them had quietly grown over the years. But today, Sarah was determined to focus on the good. Christmas was a time for family, for putting aside differences, and for making new memories. As the family gathered in the living room, settling around the Christmas tree with cups of cocoa and plates of cookies, Sarah's heart swelled with a familiar mix of love and nostalgia. After a while, when everyone had settled in, Sarah cleared her throat and smiled. "I found something in the attic yesterday," she began, looking around at the family. "Something I think we should all work on together this Christmas." Her parents exchanged curious glances, and Daniel raised an eyebrow. "What did you find?" Without a word, Sarah walked to the other room and returned with the quilt in her hands. She held it up, showing the unfinished squares and the delicate stitching her grandmother had left behind. "This is Grandma's quilt," she said softly. "She started it years ago, intending to tell our family story with each square, but she never finished it." Her mother's eyes softened immediately, a hand instinctively going to her chest. "Oh, I remember this," she whispered. "Your grandmother worked on it every winter, but she got sick before she could finish it." Sarah nodded, laying the quilt across the coffee table so everyone could see. "I thought maybe we could finish it together this year. Each of us can add a square that represents a memory or a part of our family's history. It's something Grandma would have wanted." For a moment, there was silence as everyone took in the idea. Grace, always one for family traditions, was the first to speak. "I think that's a beautiful idea," she said warmly, her hands gently brushing over one of the squares. Ellie and Tommy, who had already heard the plan, eagerly jumped in. "I'm going to add a square about last Christmas," Tommy announced, his excitement filling the room. "Me too," Ellie added. "I'll sew a snowman like the one we built last year." Even Lily and Noah, who usually kept their teenage cool intact, seemed intrigued, exchanging glances as they studied the quilt. But Daniel, always a little more skeptical, shifted in his seat. "I don't know," he said, crossing his arms. "I'm not much of a quilter, and besides, I wouldn't even know what memory to add." Sarah glanced at him, feeling the familiar pang of distance. She knew Daniel wasn't as sentimental as she was, but part of her had hoped he'd embrace the project, even if it wasn't something he typically did. Before Sarah could respond, their father, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. "You don't have to be a quilter, son. It's not about perfect stitches. It's about adding something that means something to you, something that'll be remembered." Daniel's expression softened slightly, though he didn't say anything. Grace gave his arm a gentle squeeze, offering him a look of encouragement. "You'll think of something," she said quietly, her voice filled with the warmth that had always balanced Daniel's practical nature. "Besides," Sarah added with a smile, "it doesn't have to be perfect. That's what makes it special. The stitches don't have to match. The important thing is that they're ours." For the rest of the evening, the family talked and laughed, reminiscing about past Christmases, some long forgotten, others cherished, and repeated year after year. As they shared stories, the quilt sat at the center of it all, a quiet reminder of their history and the connection they shared, even through the small tensions and differences. By the time the evening was winding down, Sarah noticed Daniel sitting quietly by the quilt, his fingers brushing one of the unfinished squares. He seemed lost in thought, his earlier reluctance melting away into something more contemplative. "Maybe I'll stitch the old oak tree," Daniel said softly, almost to himself. Sarah paused, surprised to hear him mention the tree they used to climb as kids, a memory she had long thought forgotten. "Remember how we used to sit under it in the summer?" he asked, glancing up at Sarah. She smiled, her heart warming at the shared memory. "I remember." The distance between them seemed to shrink just a little, and in that moment, Sarah knew that this quilt project wasn't just about honoring the past. It was about creating something new together, something that would bind them closer as a family, no matter how many miles or misunderstandings had come between them. The next morning, the house was quiet, but the air hummed with anticipation. The Christmas decorations glimmered in the soft light of the early morning, and outside, a fresh layer of snow had fallen during the night. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, her hands resting on the edges of the quilt. The fabric felt familiar in her hands now, like an old friend, and the unfinished squares seemed to whisper stories that were waiting to be told. Ellie and Tommy bounded down the stairs, still in their pajamas, their faces bright with excitement. They had talked about the quilt all through breakfast the day before, eager to add their own contributions. "I want to go first," Tommy said, skidding to a stop at the table. Ellie rolled her eyes in an exaggerated way only a big sister could. "Tommy, you don't even know how to sew." "I'll learn," he said confidently, climbing up onto the chair next to Sarah. "I know exactly what I want to do." Sarah smiled, pulling out the small sewing kit her grandmother had used. The needles were still neatly arranged in their case, though the thread spools had faded over time. She handed Tommy a needle, already threaded, and a small square of fabric she had cut the night before. "What are you going to add, sweetheart?" "A toy truck," Tommy said, bouncing in his seat. "Like the one I got last year, remember? And then I crashed it into Ellie's dollhouse, and we had to glue it back together." Ellie shot him a glare, but there was no real anger behind it. "Yeah, I remember." Sarah chuckled, watching her son's hands fumble with the needle as he tried to make his first stitch. "Here, let me help you," she said, guiding his hands as he carefully stitched a crooked outline of a little truck onto the fabric. It wasn't perfect, but it was his, a memory he had chosen to add, one that made the whole family laugh. Once Tommy was finished, Ellie took her turn. She chose a square of pale blue fabric and decided to stitch a snowman, one that looked just like the one they had built in the yard last year. As she worked, the room filled with the quiet hum of conversation, the sound of thread being pulled through fabric, and the warmth of shared memories. "Do you remember the snowball fight we had last year?" Ellie asked, her eyes focused on her stitches. "Uncle Daniel got hit in the face with a snowball, and he pretended to be mad, but we could all see him laughing." Sarah smiled. "He wasn't pretending for long. He got you back good, didn't he?" Ellie giggled, nodding. "Yeah, but then he let me win at the end." As Ellie worked on her snowman, Grace and Lily joined them at the table, their curiosity piqued by the progress on the quilt. Grace, always one to value family traditions, admired the work so far. "This is really coming together," she said, her fingers tracing the stitches Tommy and Ellie had made. "I think I might add something too." Lily, her teenage coolness giving way to the sense of nostalgia that had quietly settled in the house, shrugged. "I've never done anything like this before, but it might be fun." Sarah smiled at them, handing over more squares of fabric. "There's no rush. Just add something when you're ready." As the day went on, more stories began to surface, each family member contributing in their own way. Sarah's mother stitched a small square with 2 wedding rings, symbolizing her and Sarah's father's marriage. As she worked, she told the story of how they met, how they had both been too shy to talk to each other at first, but a mutual friend had brought them together at a Christmas party decades ago. "Your grandmother sewed that square for me when your father proposed," her mother said, smiling at the memory. "She always said that love was the thread that held a family together." Sarah's father, who wasn't much for sewing, quietly added his square with a simple patch of green fabric representing the farm he grew up on. "Christmas on the farm was always simple," he said, his voice soft but steady. "But it was always enough. Family and food. That's all we needed." Sarah listened to their stories, feeling a growing sense of warmth and connection. The quilt wasn't just fabric. It was their family's history, their love, their laughter, and even their struggles, all stitched together. By the afternoon, Daniel had finally wandered over to the table, watching quietly as his wife and children added their own squares. Grace stitched a small Christmas wreath, a reminder of the first Christmas they spent together as a married couple. Lily, after much deliberation, chose to sew a book, an emblem of her love for reading and the countless nights she had spent curled up with a novel by the fire. As Daniel stood there, observing the quilt's growing beauty, Sarah could see something shifting in his expression. He had always been a little distant when it came to family traditions, more focused on his career and his own life. But something about this, about adding his own square to the quilt, seemed to reach him. "You should add something too, Daniel," Sarah said gently, glancing up at him. He hesitated, his hands in his pockets. "I don't know. I don't really have anything to add." Grace looked up from her stitching, her smile encouraging. "Of course you do. We all do." After a long pause, Daniel finally sat down at the table, picking up a square of dark green fabric. He stared at it for a moment before speaking. "I've been thinking about that oak tree we used to climb when we were kids," he said quietly, glancing at Sarah. "The one in the backyard of Grandma's house. Do you remember that?" Sarah nodded, surprised that he had remembered it. "Of course I do. We used to spend hours up there, hiding from Grandma when she called us in for dinner." Daniel smiled, a rare, genuine smile that softened his usually serious face. "Yeah, I think I'd like to add that." Sarah's heart swelled as she watched him make his first stitch, clumsy but full of meaning. It wasn't about the perfection of the sewing. It was about the memories, the connection, the fact that they were all here, together, creating something that would last far beyond this Christmas. As the afternoon light began to fade and the snow continued to fall outside, the quilt began to take shape, each square telling a different story, representing a different piece of their family's history. There was laughter as they shared memories of Christmases past, and there were quiet moments too, where the weight of their shared love filled the room with a warm, comforting silence. Even Tommy and Ellie, who had initially been excited about the project for the fun of it, seemed to understand that they were part of something bigger. Ellie sat next to her grandmother, listening intently to the story behind each stitch, while Tommy proudly showed off his crooked toy truck, his chest puffed out with pride. By the time evening arrived, the quilt was nearly complete. There were still a few squares left to fill, but the majority of the work had been done. The quilt was far from perfect. Some stitches were crooked. Some squares didn't quite match. But it was beautiful in its own way. It was theirs. Sarah sat back, looking at the quilt with a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. The quilt, once abandoned in the attic, had become a symbol of their family, imperfect, but stitched together with love. As she gazed at the quilt, her eyes resting on the square Daniel had stitched of the oak tree, she realized something important. This project wasn't just about finishing what her grandmother had started. It was about continuing the legacy of family, of love, and of connection. It was about bringing them together, not just to remember the past, but to create something new for the future. The fire crackled softly as the family gathered in the living room that Christmas Eve. The quilt, now nearly finished, was draped over the back of the couch, its colors glowing in the warm light of the fire. Each square told its own story: a toy truck, a snowman, wedding rings, a book, and even the old oak tree from the childhood of Sarah and Daniel. Each memory stitched into the fabric, each thread tying them closer as a family. Outside, the snow continued to fall in soft, gentle flakes, blanketing the world in silence. Inside, however, there was warmth, laughter, and the gentle hum of voices reminiscing about Christmases past and looking ahead to new ones. Sarah sat by the fire with a cup of tea in her hands, watching her family. Her parents sat on the couch, side by side, her father's arm resting gently around her mother's shoulders. Ellie and Tommy were curled up on the rug, their excitement for Christmas morning barely contained. But still, they were entranced by the cozy atmosphere. Lily and Noah, their teenage reserve fading in the glow of the family's togetherness, were even laughing at one of Tommy's endless stories. And then there was Daniel, sitting across from Sarah, his eyes resting on the quilt. The square he had stitched, the oak tree from their grandmother's backyard, seemed to anchor him in a way Sarah hadn't seen in years. He wasn't the aloof, distant brother she had grown accustomed to. Tonight, he was present, connected, just as much a part of this family as he had always been. The evening was peaceful, filled with quiet conversations and a sense of contentment that Sarah hadn't felt in a long time. The quilt had brought them together, not just physically, but emotionally. The tension that had existed between her and Daniel had softened over the past few days, as they worked side by side, stitching memories into the fabric of their lives. At one point, Daniel caught Sarah's eye and gave her a small smile. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. It said, "I remember. I'm here. We're okay." And in that moment, Sarah knew that the distance between them was no longer something to worry about. They had bridged it, stitch by stitch. As the night grew later, Sarah's mother gently rested her hand on the quilt, her fingers brushing over the different squares. "Your grandmother would have loved this," she said softly, her voice filled with emotion. "She always wanted something like this to bring us all together." Sarah smiled, her heart warming at the thought of her grandmother. "It's not just Grandma's quilt anymore," she said, looking around at her family. "It's ours now. We've added our own stories." Her father nodded in agreement, his hand resting on her mother's. "It's the way it should be. Every generation adds something new, but the old stories stay with us." Ellie, ever curious, sat up and looked at the quilt. "What happens when we finish it?" she asked. "Is it just done?" Sarah chuckled. "Not quite, sweetheart. We'll finish it tomorrow, but that doesn't mean it's done forever. It's something we'll keep adding to as the years go by. When you get older, maybe you'll add more memories, and so will Tommy, Lily, and Noah." Tommy's eyes lit up at the idea. "I'm going to add something every year," he announced, his excitement bubbling over. Lily laughed softly, nudging him with her foot. "Don't fill up the whole quilt with trucks, okay?" "I won't," Tommy said defensively, but there was a playful glint in his eyes. The room settled again, the warmth of the fire drawing them all closer. Sarah found herself thinking about the future, not just the years ahead, but the legacy they were building now, one small square at a time. The quilt, with its crooked stitches and mismatched squares, was a symbol of their family, imperfect, but full of love, memories, and history. And as long as they continued to add to it, they would always be connected, no matter where life took them. Daniel broke the quiet with a soft, thoughtful tone. "You know," he began, his voice reflective, "I wasn't sure about this whole project at first. I thought it was sentimental." He paused, glancing at the quilt before continuing. "But working on it made me realize how much I've missed. We've all been busy with our lives, but this quilt reminded me that family is the one thing that's always there, even when we don't notice it." Sarah's chest tightened with emotion. She hadn't expected Daniel to say something so personal, but hearing him open up like that made her realize just how much the quilt had impacted him. It wasn't just a family project. It had healed old wounds, brought them closer, and reminded them of the importance of cherishing the time they had together. "Family is everything," their father added quietly. "We've been through a lot, but we always find our way back to each other." Sarah's mother smiled softly, resting her head on her husband's shoulder. "That's the true gift of Christmas." For a while longer, they sat together, watching the fire flicker and the snow fall outside. The quilt lay over their laps, a tangible reminder of the love that had woven them together. Tomorrow, they would finish it, and it would become a permanent fixture in their home, a reminder of the stories they shared and the memories they created year after year. As the fire began to dim, Sarah glanced at the faces of her family and felt a deep sense of gratitude. This Christmas, they had done more than just finish a quilt. They had stitched together the pieces of their history, woven a new bond between them, and created something that would last far beyond this holiday season. And in the glow of the firelight, Sarah knew that this was a Christmas they would never forget.